MusicalTalk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of MusicalTalk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and you join us for the last of my tribute episodes to the late, great Stephen Sondheim, who died at the age of 91 at the end of November 2021. Like the rest of the world, 2022 and the years that follow it will allow us to see more clearly what the legacy of Stephen Sondheim is and was and will be. But I don't think there's any doubt that he will be remembered as one of the great innovators of musical theatre in the 20th century, standing alongside people like Rodgers and Hammerstein and, in the generation before, Jerome Kern. And in terms of his personal standing, I think he'll be remembered alongside such luminaries as Gilbert and Sullivan and George Gershwin. Such is his standing. So we've got all that at least to look forward to in the future, as we revisit, re-evaluate and re-understand the role of Stephen Sondheim in the field of musical theatre which we all love so much. But for today's episode, I think it's time to look back again at the life of Stephen Sondheim, this time through the prism of a conversation I recorded over a decade ago with Tim Saywood. And the reason that I think that this conversation is worth revisiting is because Tim and I do spend a certain amount of time talking about what perhaps the limits of Stephen Sondheim's talents might have been. And it's not illegitimate to ask if Stephen Sondheim ever, to use the modern coinage, jumped the shark. Because it's a sad fact that almost everybody does. And it is important, I think, not to allow any unhappiness that we feel at the news of the passing of Stephen Sondheim to colour our judgment when analysing his work. I do hope you'll enjoy this conversation about the life and work of Stephen Sondheim. MusicalTalk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. I suppose the question is, what's your initial thoughts about Stephen Sondheim? If I say Stephen Sondheim to you, what do you think?
I think, first of all, well, in terms of like when I first heard about him, the first I ever heard of him was as the lyricist of West Side Story, which I think is probably the case for a lot of other people. And I didn't really know anything else about him for some years after that, until they put Into the Woods on television, and in this country, which will date me a little bit.
Early 90s, I think. It's the Bernadette Peters version.
I wouldn't like to say. And, yes, it was.
Sorry, 4 years ago. That's what I meant.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And I was very impressed by it. I was very impressed by the first act, particularly. Actually, I remember, and I struggled a bit with the second act. But I was so excited by it that I actually remembered I had an old Betamax video cassette recorder at that time. I think up in my room. It may have been a VHS, I forget. But anyway, the point is that it came on, and I was actually so hooked that I remember recording it, thinking I'm going to want to watch this again. And it was a few years after Barnum had been on TV, and I'd been really impressed by that. So there we are.
But what you said, Act 1 of Into the Woods, was it the book that you liked best, or was it the score? Was it the lyrics?
It was just the whole thing. It was just the whole concept that, you know, the fairy tale. So I mean, to be honest, had I seen any other Stephen Sondheim musical, with the possible exception of Sweeney Todd, I probably wouldn't have really been able to connect to it at that age. But obviously, it's a universal in Into the Woods. You know those characters, and you know what they're trying to do, and it was just presenting them in a really new way that I recognised because I was kind of into musicals by that time. I knew quite a lot of Andrew Lloyd Webber and had even gone as far as George Gershwin probably by that time, Porgy and Bess, that is. Yeah, it was just telling them in this very smart, funny way that just didn't, and enormously clever as well, of course, you know.
And you realise it was the same person as Stephen Sondheim who'd done the West Side Story, this musical of which you speak.
Indeed. I think I was aware of it because I think they'd done Into the Woods in the UK in 1989. And the reason I can date that is because I was doing my paper round at that time, and I remember doing lots of inserts for Into the Woods, which were being in one of the papers, I forget which one, Sunday Times or something. So I was aware of the work already. So I think actually I must have spotted that it was on and deliberately watched it. But and I just I don't know, for some reason I was interested in the image that they had.
Now,
that's how I got into Stephen Sondheim, and it was actually then like many years really before I became aware. Perhaps Sweeney Todd I probably was aware of, and then probably nothing much else for some years after that.
I'm interested how you sort of picked up. You start on the lyricist, and then you go to the whole.
Yeah.
Because obviously he's involved. I mean, we know the books of James Leigh Pine, but he was there in the workshopping, so it's a great part of Sondheim.
Sure.
But of course, he's music and lyrics there, and you've mentioned Sweeney Todd.
Yes.
Which of course music and lyrics again. So did that present you with any confusion? Not confusion, but here's someone. Lyricists don't often change track or join a second. Start riding a second horse.
No, what you mean? Do you mean switching collaborators or doing?
No, I actually
doing
meant doing music as well as lyrics.
Oh well, I mean, I certainly knew that Sondheim had written the music for those things, and I was aware that it wasn't Bernstein. And I think, again, I must have heard some of it beforehand because I knew that I was probably quite interested in Sondheim, and I don't know why I knew that, but I did. So I mean, I just like the sound of it, and I like the sound of it not perhaps more than Bernstein, but as much as, and I like the fact that it was more spare and more brain driven and more. But
angular. These are the lyrics, are we not?
No, I'm talking about the music.
You do think so?
I'm talking about Sondheim's music. More thought through, much more staccato. It's just a lot of the things that I tended to like, I think, in music
what
at that time.
Precocious fetus you were.
Indeed, yes.
Right, so I find that quite fascinating. But the fact that you're now able to analyse the music in terms of that set of emotion that you've just mentioned, the fury. Did the lyric not make you react in the same way, or
the lyrics were just very clever? I think that's the biggest thing you notice about any Sondheim lyric, really, early on, unless it's one of his more subtle ones. The ones that most people kind of that make people sit up and take notice. I mean, perhaps in Into the Woods, that massive opening musical scene, which is immensely smart. Has got lots of jokes. It's not for me. It's for my poor or hungry granny in the woods, and all of those things. They're all character jokes. And it's got puns, and it's got jokes. It's littered with puns. Yeah. I mean, Into the Woods especially. The end justifies the beans, for example, and many others as well. So I think that's the cleverness is the thing that leaps out. And certainly when I heard not the worst pies in London, the Called a Little Priest. That's right. Sorry, I had a block again. It was that cleverness, and then I gradually. Because I'd videoed it, I watched the rest of it and started to kind of appreciate the latent merits of some of the songs that I'd been a bit bored by the very first time I heard them, because I just wasn't really used to listening to stuff in that way.
Just got to go sideways here, knowing how we always, as everyone I hope, cringes at white rap, shall we say. What do you think of the which is here's my garden, aren't my vegetables lovely rap? You
should see my nectarines, as I believe she says in it. I think it's not rap at all. It is quite successful as what it is. I don't know what it is. It's Sprechstücke or something like that. It's not. It's just rhythmic
singing,
speaking, pretty much. And I think it works fine. It's not rap. It's not at all recognisable as rap, hip hop, any of those things. It's just rhythmic speech, which of course goes back to Kurt Weill, really, and which is kind of. It doesn't really quite sound like that because they tried to sex up the orchestrations to make it a little bit more poppy. But it came. 3 years after the Starlight Express, they have a song in that called The Rap, which was an equally unsuccessful attempt to do something that was a rap.
Well, anyone who was listening to the pop charts in the 80s will be fully aware that rap was mostly picked up first before it came over in any kind of. I used authentic, probably wrongly here, but
who's to say what's authentic in that?
But you know what I mean. Was mostly celebrities doing the snooker rap, or Kenny Everett doing the.
Oh yes, and the stutter rap by Morris Minor and the Majors, if you remember
exactly.
that. Exactly,
it was, but none of those were rap at all.
Yes, that's true. They were all just sort of like Gilbert and Sullivan with the melody taken out, sort of thing. Yeah, in the sense that they were patter songs, but with no melody.
Yeah. So, Sondheim, you say that it was then a few years after you...
I don't remember. I mean, I remember getting into Sweeney Todd around the sort of, a few years after that. And then I think it was a big gap before I really took a careful interest. I mean, around that same time, I saw Anyone Can Whistle for the first time with you at the Bridewell. And it wasn't a great way to get introduced to Sondheim because it's utter mess, really.
It's a flop.
as a story. Yeah,
it's a bad
exactly.
book. Not a bad production, but a bad book.
Yes, and so that kind of wasn't necessarily the biggest advertisement. And I had heard a tell of, and I think we saw Assassins as well, actually, not too far away from that sort of time as well.
We did, yes, you're right.
And I loved Assassins. I remember really being very impressed by that. And again, not
it killed you.
Exactly, it slain me. And yeah. What was good about that? That was good because it was this very idiomatic music and much more accessible, actually, in many ways than some of the stuff. And so it's only really in more recent years that I've kind of actually finally caught up with Pacific Overtures and the quote unquote harder stuff. And I still haven't seen Passion, and I'm going to miss it this time around as well because I won't get tickets for it.
No.
But that's the one. In fact, that's the one I've never caught up with in terms of its album. And there's a lot I've never seen. I never saw Pacific Overtures when it was done at the Dunbar.
No.
I saw Merrily We Roll Along around that time as well, actually. And that was one that really, I think, probably hooked me. In fact, these are all about 1999, 2000. All these things I'm talking about. Yeah. And I saw Merrily We Roll Along in 1999 when it was at the Dunbar, and I was very impressed by that. I really liked, again, the lyrics and the smartness of it, and the
I fell in love with that one through its album, funnily enough.
Yes, yeah. Well, in fact, I went in cold to the theatre for that one, and of course, it has that brilliant conceit of the going backwards in time, and it works very well. It's a polished piece. It's like it's like watching a play. In fact, that was kind of the biggest thing with Sondheim, really. Is you sit and not with Anyone Can Whistle, but with Into the Woods, and I think that's what got me. It was like, this isn't like watching a musical. It's like watching a play that just happens to sound fantastic, or rather, doesn't just happen, but
Yeah.
But and therefore, unlike Starlight Express, a big, or any big sort of tits and teeth type of musical, which are driven much more by the music and the.
But here's a question then. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, which I think sticks out like a sore thumb from his oeuvre, and is a traditional musical in a very real sense, and very accessible, and is a comedy. Quite unusual for a broad comedy, a farce, in fact.
Yeah.
Very difficult to musicalise a farce, but very, very different. So can you say there's a career progression in Sondheim that you recognise? Do you see certain themes being developed? Or is he actually just doing different things every time and they all have to sound the same because he wrote them?
The way he describes it is that he's a great imitator. That's how he says it. He imitates the voice of whatever book or whatever sort of concept he's working within. He clearly starts as someone who wants to be a Broadway composer, and he masters that first before he tries anything particularly experimental. That's not wholly true, but certainly in the case of West Side Story, he's writing Broadway lyrics for something, in a way that he slightly regretted in one or two cases afterwards. In the case of Gypsy, there is the suspicion, although I don't know if this is documented anywhere, that he was an influence on Julie Stein in terms of how the songs were structured, because they are structured in a much more sophisticated way than in sort of previous Broadway shows. The way that, for example, Some People works is the way it uses motifs and the way it moves from theme to theme. It's not your standard 32 bar jobby, as it were.
It's also the first of his somebody having a nervous breakdown musicals.
Yes, indeed, yes. And
of which he's had many since.
And that's a tour de force dramatic, musical scene. But anyway, all of this is so far in the idiom is Broadway, and the voices that people speak in is this kind of Jewish New York type of voice. And absolutely the same thing applies to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. They're New York Jews, in effect, in Rome.
Well, Zero Mostel, for goodness sake.
Exactly. So
straight off a fiddler.
So all of those things, plus Saturday Night, plus the four he wrote at in his youth before he really
the Oscar Hammerstein training school. If you like,
exactly, yes, Mary Poppins and so on. All of those were someone who hadn't really got into examining or criticising in a way the whole Broadway tradition. They were about it to a certain extent. And then came Follies and Company, and I've recently heard, and I think this is true, that Follies was a trade with Harold Prince. Harold Prince said, "I will do Follies." No, yes, that's right. I'll direct Follies if you will do this George Firth, this company thing. I don't know if that's true, but
I've never heard it, but it's interesting.
I've recently heard that, and I can't remember my source now, but. And if that is the case, that's kind of very interesting, because I think it illustrates first, once again, how Harold Prince is, the person who's really reinvented the musical for the 70s and 80s, and how Sondheim wasn't necessarily, isn't really driven by an ideology in that way. He like he says, he's an imitator, and he finds something that has potential. Then he learns its language, and then he is able to kind of produce material that serves that entirely. But you don't think of, I mean, he's sort of thought of as being a sort of artistic leader in that respect. But in some ways, I think he's a very canny follower, of his directors and his dramaturgs and James Lapine and, his assorted collaborators. And in a certain sense, they set a lot of the tone, where it pulls against Broadway. And Sondheim is such a brilliant writer that he's able to serve that.
Fascinating. If he was given poorer collaborators, we're saying that he wouldn't.
I think that's the case for anybody, no matter how brilliant.
That's true, but let's just
look
go back.
at Shakespeare's sort of collaborations. Not nearly so well thought of as his, the ones that are
Two Noble Kinsmen. It's marvellous, I tell you. I wasn't thinking, but let's just look at one of the ones where he was working with one of the greats, Richard Rodgers, in Do I Hear a Waltz?
Right.
Often considered to be the least important
of which your knowledge
is
is about 100% better than mine, I have to say. But
probably, but I love it. I think it's fantastic. I think it's almost like a return to Rodgers and Hart rather than Rodgers and Hammerstein. I know neither of the two will thank me for that, but they're not here.
No, exactly.
And like so many underrated things, I think it has so much more to give than people are seeing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a silly piece, but the music is beautiful, and the lyrics are genuinely witty and sharp. There's a wonderful one about flying on an aeroplane,
right,
where you can identify the quality of your... you can identify what the items in your aeroplane meal are by the colour of them and if they move their soup. Things like that. I mean, I haven't quoted that tremendously well, but...
yes, that's the gist.
But there's that lovely... rhyming couplet about Viennese, a waltz which is free and easy and being Viennese, and it's just throwaway stuff almost, but just light as gossamer, really. I like that a great deal, and that is a classic musical, but it is considered almost to be the least thing in his catalogue. Yeah,
because I think the things which have impressed people as sort of because the people who sort of study this sort of stuff academically, they get most excited by the things which are formal innovations, things which haven't really been done before, because all else is arguably pastiche, he said enormously dismissively. And a lot of the formal innovations, dramaturgically speaking, come from Harold Prince and Company and come from the way that was treated and, from the approach there. And musically, there was a new musical theatre language in Company which isn't really audible until that point in Sondheim.
When does Sondheim jump the shark then? Because I think he does.
Well, now, this is where my knowledge is going to fail me a little bit, because, to be honest, I don't know a great deal of the later work. Up to Assassins, I've heard... Which is
91, I think.
Which is 91, Playwrights Horizons. I'm familiar with, or reasonably familiar with the scores. I don't know the score for Passion, which... it divides people, I know, and I know it doesn't really divide you, does it? It just
well, no, but both halves of me, which were divided, both agree.
But it's not all that much cop.
But it's my least favourite song.
I've never heard it at all, so I can't comment on it. I have heard the score to Bounce, which does... The thing is...
Which isn't called Bounce anymore, of course.
No, well, a Roadshow, is that right? Is that the latest incarnation, or Wise Guys? Which... is in the musical world of Assassins, in the sense that it's kind of idiomatic American sort of folk type of inspired type of stuff.
It's not accessible American history though, because nobody knows it outside America.
No, well, I don't really mind that, but yeah, it's more the sort of the sound of it. The sound of it is a very familiar Sondheim sound that one already knows from Assassins and to a certain extent from his very earliest work. It's kind of like he sort of did a lot of his adolescent projects, because Assassins is a sort of it's a montage, and it's kind of it's thematic, and it's a concept musical, and the music is some of the least complex in a way that Sondheim has written, particularly things like Unworthy of Your Love and some of the more the folksier stuff in it. And it's kind of interesting. It feels like the project of a young man, whereas something like Sunday in the Park with George, is a mature artist at the height of his powers type of thing.
And yet the order's the wrong way around in the chronology.
Exactly, yes, but the one follows several years after the other, the wrong way around, as you say. Maybe he, as a private joke, he decided that to use Merrily We Roll Along as the template for his life.
That is a private joke, bearing in mind Merrily's not at the beginning of it, or the end of it.
Well, that's right, yes.
It's right in the middle of it.
It is. Just to confuse matters.
Right, then, if I understand you're not so knowledgeable about the later stuff then, so let me ask you a different question, although it's a variant on it. What doesn't Sondheim get right?
Oh God! I mean, the orthodoxy. Well, in musical theatre, he's a god, and everyone thinks that he gets everything right. And
but gods can be angry.
the gods can be fallible. At least the old sort of god can.
Unlike these new gods.
Yeah, I like these new gods, these newfangled infallible ones. I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, the point is, what does he get wrong? I think. Well, this is very difficult to know whether this is him getting it wrong or not. I feel that the second half of Into the Woods, and to a lesser extent some of the other musicals as well, are less good than the first halves. And I think that, as with pretty much all musicals, there is sometimes second act trouble. Whether that's a book writer's issue or how that works, I don't know. But he does sometimes. In Into the Woods, for example, I feel that he resorts to mawkish sentimentality to resolve something which just can't be resolved. They blow it open by killing, sorry to do the spoiler here, but by killing the narrator, midway through the second act. And then
that's for anyone who's not been able to catch it in the last 19 years.
Yes, exactly, yes, just in case you're waiting for the film to come out, as of course he has been for many years, for many of his shows. But after that happens, it loses its way quite significantly, and I don't know that they kind of justify the ending. Or even find one, really, that's worthy of the name. What else does Sondheim get wrong? That's a really, really hard question, because so much of it is formally so right. I mean, this is a really mean and slightly snarky thing to say, but one thing is that this is a really hard thing to explain. When I saw Merrily We Roll Along, and this is probably a purely subjective thing as well, it's like sort of saying, what did Mozart get wrong? It's kind of like hard to given that most other people got it much more wrong than he did when they get it wrong. There's sometimes a slight feeling of neatness to his work. In fact, there is a strong sort of puzzle box neatness construction, and that's kind of as much a feature as it is a bug, I suppose.
And which, of course, he's famous for. Actually, he sets problems.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
If you ever read the Sondheim Review magazine, they quite often feature puzzles that he has created for it.
Anyway, but in a sense, there's this tremendous neatness, and I suppose this is true of Mozart as well in a way, and closed offness to all of the work in the sense that it is just very neat. And it's like watching one of those films sometimes where they've really studied hard at film school and they've got all of the beats right and they've got all the acts in the right place and the climax comes exactly at the exact second when the climax is supposed to come, according to Robert McKee and that sort of thing. And while he's inventing his own rules, and that's what makes him a genius, as opposed to someone who's sort of aping, Robert McKee. There is sometimes a slight air of smugness, dare I say it, that comes off the, the finished product, because it's just neat and it's not messy the way life is messy. And as a result, it doesn't feel like he's necessarily successfully reflected the messiness of life. That's a really mean criticism, though, because in many places it is a very mature thing, and in something like Sunday in the Park with George, where there is. And of course, I've just criticised him for structurally not resolving Into the Woods. So there you go.
But anything that's baroque is by its nature intricate, and intricate suggests tidiness rather than mess, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think in a sense he is sort of classical in the case of Mozart. He is a formalist, and I think formalism went out a little bit. In certainly in playwriting, somewhere in the 50s. That's a bit rubbishy and not quite true either. But
it's a generic.
There's a sort of sense at which certainly in the 60s as well, certain kinds of formalism just didn't, were chucked away really, and the sort of the well-made play, that sounds like an old-fashioned thing these days. The thing that's well constructed and put together in a neat sort of way. So I think there's a slight feel of that comes off his pieces. But then, to be honest, he steps outside of it. I mean, Pacific Overtures. Uses a whole other set of conventions of theatre, kabuki specifically, I think it's kabuki actually.
It is.
To tell the story, and while that has a sort of formal feeling to it, it doesn't feel smug in the way that perhaps some of the other stuff does.
Musical Talk pays tribute to the late Stephen Sondheim. Right, so my next question, therefore, to you is, who is better than Sondheim?
In musical theatre? Giancarlo Menotti, opera composers, I don't know.
Who's Menotti? I don't know him.
He's an opera composer who sort of revolutionised opera in a very specific way. I won't go into now.
Yeah.
And I don't know, who's better than him? It depends what you're looking for, really. What Sondheim is kind of, I think, does amazingly successfully, and almost preternaturally so, is this truth?
Sorry, aren't they a sandwich company?
Exactly. Is the truth of the idiom of the lyrics, in other words, the sort of specific choice of words and the specific order of the words. I think, there's never a younger than springtime am I in Sondheim.
No.
Never. He would never do that. He just wouldn't.
It's that Oscar Hammerstein, you see. He's overrated.
He didn't know what he was doing. He's better than Hammerstein, certainly, in my opinion.
Oh, God, yes.
By a long chalk. So the voice is enormously truthful, and I don't know of anybody I've ever heard who does that better than Sondheim, as well as, maybe a couple. Again, it's tricky to think of, but I suppose the school of Sondheim in the Adam Gettle sense. I mean, he raised the bar that high that people like Adam Gettle and I suppose Jason Robert Brown and that sort of crowd. Your Andrew Lippers, all have had to study the craft to get to that plausibility of scansion and sense and so on. And musically, who's better than him in musical theatre? That's a much more of a taste thing, isn't it, really? Because, a lot of people would say they prefer, say Bernstein's music to West Side Story than anything Sondheim might have written for it. And
well, Russell Davies on BBC Radio often says he doesn't really like Sondheim, but it's not the lyrics, it's the music.
I just think all of those people are just totally wrong.
Really?
Say that.
But you also just said it's a taste thing.
It is a taste thing, but they're wrong. My taste suggests that they're wrong. Because I think there's just a level of sophistication. Well, this is the taste bit about it. Yeah. If you like stuff which is memorable, the tune that goes bum ba dum ba dum, and so on, a tune you can hum as he satirises it in Merrily We Roll Along. If you value all of those things, and all of those things are hard to do in themselves, then perhaps you might be less keen on Sondheim because he writes music which, is more, which doesn't have a simple structure, which isn't immediately always memorable. A lot of it is, but some of it isn't, and that. Well, I don't know. What can we say about that? But
I just want to add,
and that uses, in just literally in terms of his use of accidentals and going off the key that you think you're in and his modulations, all of those are more sophisticated.
But I think there's a misunderstanding here. You're right to make the point about the fact that people have claimed that you can't sing along, but I think that's absolutely wrong. I don't think that Sondheim can be accused of not being a melodist.
There's plenty of take-home numbers.
Yeah, and much more than, say, I find him much more accessible than Jason Robert Brown.
Right.
Myself,
okay.
For example,
fair enough.
And many others. I would prefer to listen. I can whistle a Sondheim at the bus
stop. I find. We're not talking about him, but I find Jason Robert Brown to be musically on a much less sophisticated, and Jonathan Larson, a lot of the sort of successive people, who are often touted as the heir to Sondheim. Much less sophisticated.
They don't often put the break in between Air 2 and then Sondheim.
No, well, I had to breathe, unfortunately. So
you hit it with punctuation. Carry
exactly. So I think it is. There is just a greater level of musical sophistication, and I agree with you that actually a lot of what he writes is memorable, and is, as you say, strongly melodic. It's just that the structure of it isn't. It's not. He pretty seldom writes a verse chorus number, and when he does, he's doing it for a very specific reason. It's not his default mode to do that kind of thing. It ain't Hairspray. It ain't.
No.
It ain't Hello Dolly. And good thing too.
Which raises the next question, for me at least. Stephen Sondheim, how much does he owe to Jonathan Tunick?
That's a really interesting question, which unfortunately I don't know the intricacies of their relationship to know what the truth is. But the sound...
I don't know if they've ever shared breakfast.
Exactly. The sound of the music in Sondheim is a different musical. But Tunick... The sound of Tunick.
Hey! Two minds with one thought.
Exactly, yes. Presumably you have the shirt off his back as well. Yeah. Well, the sound of the scores change significantly between all of the scores, in terms of how they're orchestrated. And there is and that is the work of, again, another brilliant imitator, which I think we have to assume is Tunick, because we know that Sondheim writes sort of multi-level piano scores, and that he certainly specifies to a certain degree what he has in mind for the orchestrations. But if you do compare like the actual detail of the orchestrations for Company to Sweeney Todd, to any of the other musicals really, to Assassins, there's clearly a lot of thought and care goes into creating a specific sound. And I don't. The bit I don't know is that to what degree does Sondheim, you know, how multi-layered are the piano scores that he hands over, and you know, could and to what degree sort of are new notes put in by Jonathan Tunick. For this, you'll have to wait till we interview someone who does know. I'm afraid, listeners.
I think it's quite interesting because I would be prepared to go so far as to say that Jonathan Tunick is the sound of Sondheim. Was thinking earlier, for example, Cole Porter, who's at least a parallel in the sense he's a words and music man and a very strong lyricist.
Yes.
It was something you said earlier. When Cole Porter writes a song, a patter song or whatever he's doing, a comedy song or a love song, it's a Cole Porter song, it sounds like a Cole Porter song, and anyone can sing it, usually out of context, because no one ever goes to, well, that's not true, people do go and see Anything Goes, but Cole Porter is played on the radio or whatever all the time.
They're standards.
Yeah, they are standards, and people can tell it's a Cole Porter or have a sense of it being a Cole Porter. Stephen Sondheim is the great imitator, the great actor in composing, and therefore it's not the same voice. You could take a patter song out of one Cole Porter and put it into another one. You couldn't do that with a Sondheim.
You certainly couldn't do that with a Sondheim, for the reasons we said.
So if he's so chameleon-like, what is it that sounds like a Sondheim song? Okay, is it Jonathan Tunick?
So what I think makes no, I don't think it's. I think Jonathan Tunick. I think Jonathan Tunick is the differentiator. I think he's the thing that makes the Sondheim scores sound different. I think the things that makes them sound the same, and therefore is the Sondheim touch, if you like, is this business of the staccato vocal line which runs to subdivisions of the crotchet. Okay.
Yes.
So typically, if you listen to, for example, the opening number of Pacific Overtures, it begins in the middle of the world.
Specifically Pacific Overtures. Specifically that one.
Yes, exactly. I feel there's a lyric coming. There's possibly Sondheim-esque lyric coming out of that. In the middle of the world, da da dum, bum ba dum, bum bum bum. Bum ba dum bum, can't remember the words. Dun dun dum, bum 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 bum. You know, all of those little angular intervals, and the fact that it's going bada 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 bum, bada bum, bada bum, bada bum. All that stuff. That is the Sondheim sound. It's the staccato quavers and semiquavers of equal length. Yeah. Backed up by could be anything in the orchestrations, and then the soaring bit in the middle. And that's your classic. If you were pastiching Sondheim, that's what you would do.
I'll tell you what you've just said to me, however, or the resonances I'm getting. I'm suddenly Stephen Sondheim, the American Noel Coward. Discuss.
Perhaps, yes. I mean, to be honest, yeah. It's that slight. The difference between him, if you look at those rhythms, the difference between the rhythms of that and say like rap, and hip hop of like the last sort of 20 years or so, is that there's a lot more syncopation going on in the hip hop than there would be in the Sondheim, and the Sondheim has this slight clockwork regularity feel, and the excitement for me, at least in Sondheim, this is probably what got me excited all those years ago when I saw Into the Woods for the first time, was the tension between the regularity of the setting and the naturalness of the vocal sound. So in other words, it is regular and slightly robotic is far too strong a way of putting it, but automatic, mechanistic, and at the same time it's entirely naturalistic because he stacks up all of the syllables so that they flow as if it sounds like recorded speech, and that is also the sound of New York Jewish conversation. Yes. and that I think is the fundamental Sondheim sound,
which is ironic because that's what takes it away from Noel Coward again then, because Noel Coward, no one would ever identify Noel Coward as speaking in a naturalistic way, and his songs are Noel Coward songs, and like Cole Porter they do have this
bubba da bubba da bubba da bar, been to a marvellous party, and absolutely. Couldn't have liked it more.
It's the singing metronome stuff.
Absolutely. And I think I mean, obviously there are many other aspects of Sondheim. There are probably bits of his musicals that I'm not particularly fond of, that are another side of him that I'm just not particularly connecting to. But that's the one that gets me, and that I think a lot of people, when Kit and the Widow did their People Who Like Sondheim thing, that's what they were pastiching.
Yes.
They were pastiching the quick fire, rapid machine gun delivery type of stuff. Which has its antecedents in Gilbert and Sullivan and in the Cole Porter patter songs and so on.
Praise for Gilbert and Sullivan,
and in many other more talented subsequent writers.
I've got the editing button on this game.
Oh, shame. Yeah. And that's what people are picking up. And the other bit is the fact that you have a section of that, and then there's a soaring bit as well, and that's also highly likely for Sondheim. So, for example, it's interesting to sort of look at other people who are pastiching him almost more than it is to look at the original material, oddly. So, for example, in Big the Musical, which is Shire and Maltby and Shire, there is a number which is, I think, clearly intended to be a sort of Sondheim-inspired number.
Same in Bat Boy.
Yes. I can't. What is it in Bat Boy? It's 3-bedroom house, isn't it?
It is.
In Big, although it's again musically less sophisticated, it's the one that the heroine sings. She's in the toy factory, and God, now this is going to be a challenge to bring this up. Wait while I go down to the archives of my mind and try and find this one. So it's got this little pattering cymbal thing underneath it, and it's just come clear. Well, it's basic. Psyched that the man I'm with I don't even like. Here we go again. And those two things are basically
into the woods.
Sort of, and anyone can whistle. It's that feeling. So you've got da da dun 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 da da dun 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 da da dun 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 da da dun dun da. And then those little rising things as well, which he gets off Ravel and Debussy and all of those sorts of people. And then that soaring bit with the patter still going on in the orchestration underneath it, but the soaring notes over the top. And then a little pause bit. I wish da 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 dum da dee da 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 da. And it's all rubato and it's all collo voce and it's all sort of done at its own pace. And that's what people characterise as the Sondheim sound. And that I think is true. I think that's actually kind of what you get. And it comes to its brilliant climax in Sunday in the Park with George, where it actually becomes meaningful as this idea of pointillism, and the sort of everything made of tiny little points. Form. It is, yeah. Yes. And yeah, you.
Oh, apotheosis! I do like
apotheosis. What a lovely word. I'm sure he must have set it somewhere in one of those shows. I just can't remember.
What do you rhyme it with?
I don't know, mitosis.
Halitosis.
Yeah. Apotheosis. We only have to rhyme the last two syllables, so there's quite a lot of possibilities.
Here's
toesies. Moses proposes.
Wasn't there there's also there's an Egyptian pharaoh or god called Tutmosis as well, isn't there?
Oh, there you go. Well,
anyway, you were talking about how much you can see what people think of Sondheim from the parodies of Sondheim, but I want to take us back to the tunic thing. There are lots of people who cover Sondheim in pop. Well, I say lots. There are a number of Sondheim songs which are made it. I mean, Losing My Mind, Sending the Clowns. I've heard Cleo Lane sing Liaison from A Little Night Music. And what they are, of course, is they're being recorded. The Pet Shop Boys did Losing My Mind.
They did, that's right. Liza Minnelli, it was, yeah.
Of course, and I think actually almost they're the best example. Very, very different orchestrations. Do you? Because they're also. I was going to say because I think they stop sounding like Sondheim songs.
I agree with you. I think
which takes me back to Tunic being the Sondheim sound.
Yes, I think. I think it's Losing My Mind. I mean, Losing My Mind is a much more. First of all, Losing My Mind falls into the category of Sondheim songs, which isn't recitative Sondheim. It's aria Sondheim, and there is a difference. And in particular, a lot of the Sondheim and in Follies in particular, a lot of those are pastiches, or they're pastiches of songs from the Follies, and so they run to slightly different rules, and in fact the Sondheim in Follies really, the bits which are the recognisably Sondheim bits are things like The Road You Didn't Take and those sorts of things, where it's recitative. It's contemporary characters speaking in a contemporary voice, and he uses that.
More of your bumpity stuff, in
fact. With that little augmented fourth that he sticks in it, and it's not that's Sondheim. That's not the orchestrator in that case. So there's that bit, but a lot of the score of Follies is these things which it is a requirement of the show that they must be entirely authentic and sound like they could have been songs from that era. So I think that's a different case.
It's like Chicago, but done well.
Well, I happen to like Chicago as well, but yeah, exactly, that kind of idea. So much so that... and Losing My Mind obviously comes in the Loveland sequence at the end, and I think, well, now what are we supposed to make of that? Are we supposed to assume that it's like Buddy's Blues, it is a pastiche of a Follies number? Because in some ways it isn't.
I don't know which one that would be, though.
No,
I mean, it's the one that's always described as Sondheim's pop number. Which is actually how I've seen it described on many occasions. I think that could be lazy journalism, but
there are other pop numbers. There's Unworthy of Your Love in Assassins, and there is in Sweeney Todd, sticking out like an absolute sore thumb, Nothing's Gonna Harm You, which to me doesn't sound anything like the rest of that score. And I think, he's not an idiot. He knows that you've got to have a real take-home ballad that actors are going to want to sing in auditions forevermore afterwards. In a show, and that to me sounds very much like a sort of more contemporary pop sound, and it is a sign of Sondheim that I think people sort of forget, because the people like me who get excited by the formal innovations, that's the bit that gets them going, and we tend to slightly disregard the sort of the cheesy bits, even though we actually quite secretly enjoy listening to those bits too.
Start a question. Your favourite Sondheim, your least favourite Sondheim?
Oh, that's just totally impossible. Let's go between the one I admire the most and the one I enjoy the most, because that's a slightly different thing.
Well, let's try that one then.
So Sunday in the Park is obviously the one I admire the most, because it's an amazing achievement.
It's not the one you like the most, clearly.
It's not the one I perhaps enjoy the most, in the sense of really get down. It's like I admire amazing haute cuisine, but
you don't cook
I don't know if I love a Chinese takeaway at times. And what's Sondheim's Chinese takeaway? Probably it's Sweeney Todd, which is obviously also artistically a very successful piece, but that probably is the one that is the most easy to relish while you're listening to it. Possibly Into the Woods as well on that score. And the one that I think sits right in between those two categories is Pacific Overtures and Merrily We Roll Along actually as well, but Pacific Overtures perhaps more, because that has that dignity and artistic credibility that I think one or two of the other things, like Funny Thing for example, lack, but at the same time it has a very it's very enjoyable in the eating. And so I think that kind of, so in some ways Pacific Overtures is my favourite, because it kind of combines those two things.
Least good?
I don't like If Anything Happened on the Way to the Forum.
Oh, you don't? Is it the score?
Well, I like a lot of the score. A lot of the score is fun, but I tend to find that when I've got the album on my iPod, I would skip to Pretty Little Picture, and what else is good in that?
Well, one of my favourite Sondheim songs is in it.
Go on, you have to spill the beans.
I don't remember that one. It's called That Dirty Old Man. Because for
don't
me,
like it.
You see, for me, that's the one that's the most like a Sondheim number in that show for me.
Well, yes,
it's genuine. It also has a very unusual effect, but it's one that I can actually make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up for some reason. It's a plaintive, it's a lament, actually.
It is pretty good, but it's not. I know what you mean.
Although, just as a sideshow, I have to say that it's the musical that we did in my sixth form when I was 18. I was stage manager on it.
Oh, okay.
And so the first time I ever saw it performed was because I went to an all-boys school. It was a boy in drag with the hairiest armpits I've ever seen.
Brilliant.
Lamenting the loss of his
well, in a way it's quite appropriate to the
husband.
Style. Yes, exactly.
Oh yes, the integrity was in no way lost.
Exactly. I do quite like that song actually. Actually, but the one but typically if I'm in that score, I tend to find myself skipping Everybody Ought to Have a May, which goes on interminably. Oh. I don't particularly like We Not Only Won.
Left, right.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, exactly. But we won too.
Yeah. You don't, or you do?
I find that a bit puerile, to be honest.
Was that bit or the whole song?
The whole song.
Bring Me My Bride. Because I really like the opening part. I think that's clever.
No, not mad on it. But Pretty Little Picture, which describes itself extremely immodestly at the end as a pretty little masterpiece, is a masterpiece. And so I think that's great. It's just, you can't help but admire the sort of, it's like a little sort of perfectly frosted Viennese cake or something like that. You can't help but admire the rhyme structure and the way that everything just fits perfectly together. It is a masterpiece. It's a smug masterpiece, but why not? It's bloody clever.
Do you know there's a fabulous cut? Well, there's two fabulous cut songs. Well, lots of fabulous cut songs, but there's two fabulous cut songs from Forum. The first is Love Is in the Air, which was the
which I don't really know that well. I think I've heard a echoey piano recording of it. Yeah.
But there's a lovely one which is where.
Love I Hear is good as well, actually. Isn't it?
Oh yes, that's a nice song. But the cut one I like so much because it's such a clever song and it's such a shame it's not there. Is where Philia, the lovely winsome girl next door, is speaking to her gods, and Hero is hiding in the house.
Oh yes, it's the Echo song, isn't it?
So yes, the Echo song. When she sings something, he then repeats the relevant bits back, and so and it always works out that in some way it's encouraging her to run off with him until the very last line when he has to. pretend to follow the echo and then say something completely different,
Yes,
and it all collapses in itself.
Yeah.
It's a very funny ending to a very nice song, but you
really-
think, well, all these
they're
lovely
clever.
cut things. Yeah.
But it's not my favourite show, partly because I don't really very much like the show. I find it a bit boring. Sorry. It's amazingly well constructed, and to be honest, again, it's like all Sondheim. If you say I'm a bit bored by it, it's still like heads and shoulders over like 500 other musicals I could probably not... Yeah. Well, I could name now, but we don't really have time.
You would go and see it if it was on in London, but you would only see it once.
Well, I did see it once at the National Theatre, and I was a bit annoyed by it then, actually, I have to say.
Really?
Because
I think I was with you, wasn't I?
Yes, you were indeed.
Yeah.
We were sitting next to Ming Wong, if I remember rightly.
Absolutely.
And it was... What about it? It was...
Did you not see it at the Open Air Theatre as well?
No, I never saw that production.
With Roy Hudd, he was.
What annoyed me about it was just that it's very retro. Clearly, it inspired the whole Frankie Howard Up Pompeii thing, didn't it?
Well, he was cast as Hewlett in London.
Exactly.
Interestingly, I heard only the other day, but David Jacobs on BBC Radio 2 was saying that at the time it was generally considered that the London production was slightly better than the American production. Well, just because Frankie Howard really took it over and made it his own.
Right, okay. Well, of course, yeah.
Well, so did Zero Mostel,
of
course.
Yeah, exactly.
But Zero Mostel already had a hit.
Anyway, but to me, it's not the most satisfying either score to listen to or piece to watch. And I'm not a Sondheim geek, really. In the sense that I don't know all of the work.
You have so many other adjectives to put in front of geek.
Exactly. I don't know all the work, and I don't, so I do just like the things that I like in a way, and that's not one of them, except for the many masterpieces it contains, as I've just explained. And are there any other shows that are particularly stand out? Assassins I'm very fond of, but I enjoy listening to quite a number of bits of it, but it doesn't. It's not quite up there for me. Sunday in the Park is the greatest achievement, and Sweeney Todd is also a great achievement, and Pacific Overtures. Those three. I didn't even mention Company or Follies, which is just astonishing.
There's something about the one thing that really irritates me about Assassins, I ought to say, by the way, is it's at least one song too short. It doesn't feel like an integrated musical whole.
No.
Well, it does. It feels like an integrated musical whole with a W.
With an H, yes.
Yeah.
So what's your favourite Sondheim musical and or most admired?
Actually, that is actually a very difficult question, and I wish I hadn't asked you because you've now asked me. I can tell you, I'm going to do what you did, actually. I'm going to prevaricate a little bit by telling you my history with Sondheim, which was I did a funny thing happen on the way to the forum.
Did a funny thing?
Yes, I did. Well, only once. I did a funny thing happened at school, rather, so I was 18. And at the same time, I was listening to a lot of BBC Radio 2, and I remember they did a précis. It was a Friday night, his music night.
That's
or something
the sort of
like
a précis. It's very messy.
And they did Company in 10 minutes.
Right.
And I remember I taped it, and I fell in love with it immediately. And I used to play that 10 minutes over and over and over and over again, which I think is an interesting one to come in on, funnily enough, because bearing in mind I was, I think when that was on the radio, I was about 17.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of an appropriate age for that.
Yes. And it was part of a bigger picture of I was going through. I'd fallen in love with George Gershwin and Fred Astaire musicals and things like that.
Right.
The 30s, and I just.
I don't remember the I've fallen in love with George Gershwin musicals.
Oh, yes, it was very popular at the time. I had the T-shirt made up and everything. Couldn't sit down though, and So I just saw myself as moving through the history of musical theatre.
Yeah.
By moving from the 30s through to the 60s, as I saw it, because a funny thing happened. And actually from Gilbert and Sullivan to begin with, because I'd actually fallen in love with Gilbert and Sullivan first. So it was Gilbert and Sullivan, Fred Astaire, George Gershwin, and then Stephen Sondheim. So it just seemed a natural progression. I had to stop it.
Yeah, you went the right way round.
Chronologically, yes.
I did it backwards. I did 20th century classical, and then I skipped ahead of that to contemporary, and then backwards from Sondheim, and then since then I've done everything else.
Haven't really hit much 19th century though, have you?
I've not touched the 19th century, and I've barely got into the 30s, to be honest. I know very little Rodgers and Hart, and I know very little musical comedy of the 30s.
You're missing a treat in my view, but there we are. So I got into that, and then I liked Into the Woods, which I saw 3 or 4 times in London with Juliet Mackenzie.
Oh, yes.
And I actually did go and see it a couple of times, and bearing in mind I was 19, something like that. It was 89, I think.
It's amazing you knew Julia Mackenzie, really.
It was quite expensive, actually.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I remember about it. I was at university. I didn't have money to spare, but I saw it a couple of times. And I think that's when it was completely cemented for me, and I bought all the soundtracks or borrowed them all from the record library, as one did in those days. But I think it was Merrily, actually. Merrily We Roll Along was the one I actually really cemented it all for me. So I suppose I've always got a soft spot for Merrily, even though I can see it's a massively flawed show.
Yeah. Well, what are the flaws of Merrily We Roll Along?
Well, historically, they're always identified as being the fact that it was difficult to see what was going on because it's going on backwards.
But I think they fixed that, because by the time I saw it, the version I saw, I totally got it.
But you didn't see the original, so
no, exactly.
And they have rewritten it, of course, slightly and tweaked it.
I know, yeah.
But I like Merrily best of all, I think. But there's very few. So I mean, I can listen to almost any Sondheim, except Passion.
Yeah.
And Bounce is always a disappointment, although there's some lovely, lovely stuff in it. There's just not enough lovely stuff in it.
I've never got that far.
I really like Saturday Night. I find it lovely. I know you don't. You find it conventional. Actually, it's his biggest crime for you, isn't it?
Well, it's not really conventional. It's just not that good. I mean,
musically?
No.
Really not?
No, I think it ain't that. Yeah.
I think it's like a table wine. I think it's a good blend.
Yeah.
It does nothing. But it does what it does. I think the nothing it does very nicely.
Yeah, I think he hadn't quite mastered that whole voice thing at that time, character voice.
But I still prefer it to Anyone Can Whistle, for example.
Well, I mean, totally. Yeah. Which is a mess.
Yes, no, it is a mess.
So, so you're not plumping for a favourite, but...
Well, I'm going to go for... I think I'll go for Merrily.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Ironically. Yes. I'd like to investigate a little bit around the corners of the standalone sometimes, the songs which have escaped that aren't from musicals necessarily, or the musicals that... I mean, do you know anything about Evening Primrose, which only has 4 songs?
I've heard a couple of the songs from it. Yeah. I don't really know much more than that.
I Remember.
I've heard I Remember. And
If You Can Find Me, I'm Here, which
those
is
are the
good.
two I've heard, yeah.
And then there's The Frogs, which I spoke about relatively recently here on MusicalTalk, which isn't very good.
No. Again, I would tell... I mean, sorry, for the benefit of me, I suppose, really, given that listeners probably would have heard about it before. What's the conceit? Is it like Funny Thing, in the sense that it's a sort of archaic, classical type of era type of thing?
Yes, but it doesn't
vaudeville.
But it doesn't have the oomph
right.
that... Because I know you're not a great fan, but it does have a certain power and pace, because it's a farce.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take itself at all seriously, and it's great fun. This, unfortunately, is a mixture of trying not to take itself seriously, and indeed the Nathan Lane version, when it was revived recently on Broadway for the first time, actually made it to Broadway for the first time, because it was originally in the Yale swimming pool.
Yes.
But, it's taken 15, 20, 30 years to get anywhere, and Nathan Lane made something of it, having just played Pseudolus in a huge revival, which really made his name on Broadway, or helped cement it. And Sondheim had added a few new songs, but it falls into that kind of... Instead of being a send-up of a Greek play, it actually owes too much to its Greek roots.
Right, okay.
In my view, so it retains the original Greek chorus of the Frogs, which is all very charming, but, it doesn't speak that much to a modern audience.
No.
So it feels like a Funny Thing happened, but toned down 3 or 4 levels.
Right. Okay.
And I know.
Is it more whimsical?
No, I think it's
less whimsical.
I think it's less whimsical. Right. I think it's less funny. I think it absolutely depends on one character and one character alone, the central lead. And it's just...
Because let's talk about Sondheim humour, because that's a really big area, actually. I mean, it seems to me that Sondheim is... You can't have a Sondheim without humour, or can you? Passion, you would say, is the one without humour.
Also, to a degree,
it is almost...
Sunday in the Park is quite humorless.
It's certainly not predicated in any way on a gag.
Yeah, the bouncy
there is
song
humour. There's plenty. Right. Well, I'm now going to struggle to think of an example of humour in Sunday in the Park. But
Everybody
there is
Loves Louie is the bounciest song, but it's not a funny song.
It's hot up here. I mean, the conceit.
Sorry?
Yeah, okay, it's not that funny. A lot of the things that the old woman says are quite funny.
Yeah, but does that make a funny music? No.
Well, it's not. It's not a comedy musical. But I mean, there is humour in everything that's in. Well, many of the things that Sondheim does. We've just established.
Yeah, I mean, I agree.
Assassins is not that humorous in many ways. I mean, again, the Gitto ballad and some of I suppose, yeah.
And it's the woman who keeps fumbling her gun every time.
I got this great little gun. Shit, I dropped it, or shit, I shot it. Oh shit, where is it? Yeah.
Well, that's quite funny.
Yeah, true. If only I could remember it. It's all in the timing.
But I tell you what,
Sweeney Todd is obviously significantly comic.
Well, right, let's go back to a discussion we've already had on Musical Talk. Yes, Little Priest, fantastic. Mrs. Lovett, generally funny.
That's really.
By the Sea sticks out like a sore thumb, completely misplaced, appalling, deliberate attempt to just wedge in a last bit of comedy before it goes on the roller coaster ride.
This whole business of it's the Officer Krupke thing, isn't it?
Yes.
Stick a bit of comedy in the second act. And I mean, I had a heated debate the other day with someone who's very keen on them the other way round. In West Side Story, this is Officer Krupke and Cool, because as I'm sure know, they in the film they're the wrong way round, so to speak, compared to the stage show. And I prefer them the way round they are in the film, because I think I like the inexorability of it all being tragic towards the end. But Broadway convention says otherwise. And I guess you're saying, well, that's why By the Sea is where it is.
For me, it just feels like a bolt-on. It feels like let's have a I mean, it is. It feels like it's a mechanical moment rather than a genuine moment.
I must admit, I do enjoy it, and I do enjoy it as a sort of emotional moment. But I think, as I say, we did have this discussion at the time, didn't we? And I think it works. But
I tell you, I mean, let's tie up a couple of loose threads here. I was touching, I think, very briefly on those songs which have come from non-theatre shows. So, have you ever heard any of the songs he wrote for The Birdcage? Which was the film version of the very crass film version of
yes, with Robin Williams and some other guy,
Nathan Lane, I think. And many of them were cut.
And were they sort of the diegetic songs? Sorry to use the word.
Well, yes and no. But he wrote a "We Are Family" gay theme tune.
Right. He wrote that.
Well, he didn't write that, and it was.
But it was a bit like that.
Well, it was so much like that, and not as good as, and attempting to be funny and really not being funny.
Oh, right.
That it was cut and replaced with Sister Sledge.
You see, I mean, it's interesting. It's good to know that gods do have off days.
Oh, indeed. Yeah.
In a sense, I mean, it's a bit like John Cleese not being funny after A Fish Called Wanda.
Yeah, I was thinking after 1980, whenever it was.
Yes. It does happen eventually to the best of them.
Well, which takes us back to that question about when did he jump the shark? I think Stephen Sondheim's worst moment is he's outlived himself. If he had died after Assassins.
Oh, blimey!
I'm not wishing death on him. I think he's a marvellous
He died
man.
after Assassins had done what exactly?
Finished him off.
I don't know. Well, I suppose that's true because I haven't been terribly interested in anything he did subsequent to that. I mean, a bit like Andrew Lloyd Webber, presumably should have carked it after the Phantom.
Well, there is something to be said. Well, possibly just beforehand, in my view. But yes, I agree. Carked it. I like.
Yeah.
So there are songs that there are some. They retained a couple of songs. Actually, am I being unfair? When did Dick Tracy come out? That was. You see, I think that's about the same time.
92, 93, maybe. I'm guessing.
And I really like the songs from Dick Tracy.
Might have been earlier, actually.
Sooner or Later.
Yes. Again, I must admit, because I'm not a completist, I've heard one or two of these numbers, but I've never really looked at them in great depth, if you know what I mean. So I don't necessarily feel like I know them that well. And
he was still writing songs. There was a musical film which had a song released by Stephen Sondheim in it, and then they never made the film. And I think it was called what was it called? Dancing Out Loud or something like that. And it was a song called More Water Under the Bridge.
Right.
Which was actually a very good song, and I think that's almost his last gasp of decency, to be honest.
Right. Okay. So what happens? What happened to him in your view, in the sense of jumping the shark?
I think he outlived.
Can I point out actually that as has been pointed out to me recently, I've been using the term jumping the shark, and somebody has pointed out to me that jumping the shark is supposed to be when something gets absurd and ridiculous.
Oh right, rather than going off
the boil.
Right. When did he go off the boil then?
Exactly.
Right. Well, I think he lost his mojo, to use another horrible modern phrase. I really do think it's about the mid-90s, and I think that's exactly the time when all the young pretenders came up and wrote other Sondheim shows that aren't Sondheim shows.
Were, yes, yeah.
And there's something there's Sondheim in every show. We went to see Ragtime a few years ago, and there's enough Sondheim in that to keep you going.
Ragtime, well,
I know you think, but I still think there's Sondheim coming out of it. And if you listen to Titanic,
it's certainly. I mean, as I think anything subsequent to Sondheim in musical theatre pretty much is influenced by Sondheim. And there's no question that Ragtime is, but
and all the Jason Robert Brown oeuvre.
But musically, it's not at all Sondheim.
And Jonathan Larson.
Yes. Well, Jonathan Larson's a really fascinating case, actually. I mean,
but I wonder what would happen if he'd lived, to be honest. But
that's
something to discuss another time.
Yeah.
I think this happens to a few people Edmundo Ross, taking us on a sidestep. Edmundo Ross was a band leader.
Yes.
Well, do you know him?
Yes.
Just celebrated his 99th birthday, and I wish him every success. I want to hear the programmes about his
You wish him
centenary
at least another year, exactly. Yes.
Well, I wish him several more, but I actually quite like Edmundo Ross. But he's a highly intelligent Scots Trinidadian man.
Yep.
Fantastic. The Ross is the Scots, and they just dropped one of the S's off to make him more exotic. And he ran a band that did Latin American music in the heyday of British bands. The second heyday of British bands, which is the 50s and 60s. Same time, he was a contemporary of Ted Heath's big band.
Yep.
And he ran
not the Prime Minister of the same name.
That's right. But although he was a conductor, of course, but that's a different thing.
For years, I actually thought that Ted Heath was that Ted
Really?
Heath for that reason. Because I knew he was a musician. I'd always assumed he'd gone on after Downing Street and set up his own band.
Very much in the Count Basie style.
Exactly. Yes. After Mrs. Thatcher knocked him out of it.
But he never lost his rhythm.
Exactly.
But Edmundo Ross, and this is a sidestep I appreciate, but he did big band music, strict tempo, good dancing, nice rhythm, la la la. And then in the 70s, when all the big bands died, certainly, the last gasp, Joe Loss was finishing, all these people, it disappeared, and he went off to live in his retirement, and he completely outlived his kind of music.
Right.
And it must be quite sad to be in a situation where you've outlived your music. Now, I don't think Stephen Sondheim has outlived his kind of music, but I think his kind of music has mutated into the next generation, which is Sondheim-esque.
Yeah.
And he is no longer Sondheim-esque, and he's no longer quite Sondheim. So he's no longer quite anything, which is actually why none of his real shows, his recent shows, have been haven't been any good.
It's always,
I'm going to say it.
Yes. I mean, it's always sad if something like that happens. But let's be honest, Mozart was dead at 35. And
How old are you?
Oh, yeah.
Don't answer.
Sondheim has this amazing repertoire of
he does.
but
it's all behind him,
which is absolutely he's 80 for poor soul, and it is absolutely the envy of every other musical theatre composer.
Oh yeah.
And lyricist indeed, and book writer to a certain extent as well.
But let's put it this way: he is the greatest musical voice of he's one of the greatest musical voices of the 20th century.
Personally, I would go the whole hog and say the greatest.
I still get more fun out of Gershwin.
Yeah, but Gershwin wasn't the whole deal. I don't think, if you see what I mean.
I think he had a wider range.
Well, I suppose with the Porgy and Bess. Anyway,
discussion for another time.
Oh, yes, that's an interesting controversy. But I think for musical, what we might call music theatre, I think Sondheim beats the rest hands down.
But the point I'm
making, because he defined the art form.
But he redefined the art form.
Exactly.
The 20th
Which no one else, except possibly Brecht and Weill, did really.
Yeah, you say that, but the art. Well, no, I disagree with you because the art form. The art form of the 1930s is different from the art form of the 1900s.
Okay.
So, you have to argue that Irving Berlin and Cole Porter and George Gershwin...
And Hammerstein, of course.
Well, actually, I'd say Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern, and then Cole Porter, and then George Gershwin, and then...
Oscar Hammerstein?
Richard Rodgers.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I really don't think Oscar Hammerstein did it for Showboat, but I don't think he did it for Oklahoma.
Right.
No, let's
again another one.
Oh my goodness, episodes. But Stephen Sondheim is one of the major figures of the 20th century in terms of musical theatre. He is not one of the major figures of the 21st century in musical theatre.
No, it's moving. Well, nobody knows which direction it's about to move into. I think we've. Well, that's again yet another topic that we could go into. But what is the post? What do we think of the? However, we should just perhaps briefly touch on the post Sondheim crowd and the Andrew Lippers and the Adam. In a way, it's kind of a bit silly to lump them all together because if you compare Jonathan Larson to Jason Robert Brown to Andrew Gettle, they're doing quite profoundly different things in many ways, and yet they're all quite clearly influenced by Sondheim. Now, in what
does
respect,
influenced by mean acolyte of?
Well, they're all admirers of him. I'm fairly certain I'm right in saying, but I think it's this idiomatic, use of the lyric that is the hallmark that they've sort of inherited from Sondheim. In other words, this highly plausible dialogue-like type of lyrics. Again, the ones that I get off on, so to speak, as opposed to the more sort of poetic ones. And that's probably what they've inherited more than anything else. And there is a I don't know if you'd call it a backlash exactly, but there has been a strong move in the musical comedy direction, or back in the musical comedy direction, or perhaps it never went away. In the 80s. If you look at Lacadio Fall,
there was a bucket of po-face though.
Yeah, well, yes, yeah.
Have you sat through Titanic?
No. Oh, you mean the Maury Yeston thing?
Yeah, and then there's well, actually, Ragtime's not funny, and
Ragtime has funny moments.
Oh, Take Me Out to the Ball Game or whatever it's called. He's not funny. We've discussed this before.
It's not that funny.
And then there's what's that?
It's not classic comedy.
There's another wretched one that's. I'm just trying to think of some of the. I can't remember. There was a recent musical which I think everything got very. No, my memory's gone.
Les Mis? I mean, what?
No, well, it's a bit earlier, isn't it? But I really do think there's been a hell of a lot of po-facedness. Oh, all of Andrew Lloyd Webber for the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's a very broad category you're drawing there, but yes,
it is, yeah.
Indeed, yeah. But it's true, actually, there's a certain lightness of touch and a certain levity, and I think that's kind of what I was getting at earlier when we were talking about humour to Sondheim. There's a certain levity which is totally the inheritance of the classic Broadway musical comedies, but is not of it. It's just sort of, it's just a sort of tone.
He's lighter than Oscar Hammerstein.
Yes, I think that's true.
So
in many ways.
In that sense, he's the
there are
Lawrence Hart.
Where there are laughs in Sondheim, they are quite they come quite often. Except so I think there's that sense of levity, and that may be one of the things that again that can be slightly smug about it. Interestingly. And apparently insincere, and I think that's one of the things that people kind of maybe react against in Sondheim. Those who don't quite go for him.
I think that people who don't like him because they perceive him as being intellectual rather than emotional, which I think is a misunderstanding.
I think there's something in it, though.
Yes, well, he's the most intellectual of the writers.
Things are justified in explicit terms, in cognitive terms, and I think he that is sort of how he operates.
Although often it's about repression of the emotional self failing.
Yes.
So actually it is actually about the volcanic eruption of emotion.
Quite true as well, yes. No, I mean there's no question of that. But yes, a lot of the, I suppose it's more the construction and there's sort of that sort of game playing that side to it that seems, as you say, repressed or at a low temperature.
Yes. Not quite frigid, but
yes,
cool.
Cool.
In all its senses.
Cool. Sometimes cool, kids.
Yes, listen up. Tim, as always, you bring a great, if I may say, cool and intellectual approach to the discussions. But that was fascinating, if you don't mind me saying, exploring your personal intake. It was fascinating discussing your personal take on Stephen Sondheim. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
This tribute episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at MusicalTalkThos.